In this video, we're going to look at accessing MySQL in Spring Boot. There are several ways to do this, but what we're going to do is to use the standard Java concepts that we have already described in the previous video. There are better ways of doing it, but for now we'll stick with what we have looked at, if only so that later on when we look at the other ways, the better ways in Spring Boot, we'll understand what's going on in the background. Now, these other ways will be described in other learning blocks. Now, the first thing we need to do is to create a database. If you don't have XAMPP, then download it and install it from here. And that will give you access to MySQL and also to Apache. When you have opened the XAMPP control panel, click on the Start button to run MySQL, and then click on the Start button for Apache. And when you've done that, and you can see that you have port numbers for both of those, then click on Admin for MySQL, and it will open in a web browser a window onto your database, the MySQL database, and that's called phpMyAdmin. Now you'll need a new database, and by clicking New, you'll get this dialog box, and you can enter the name of your database in here, and then click Create. Now that will create the database, but it won't have any tables yet. And for this example, we shall need the book table. So what you can do in the SQL tab for phpMyAdmin is to run this SQL that will create the book table with these two columns. And when you've clicked on the Go button, it will execute the SQL and you'll see the book table appear in the list down here. With the database created, we're then ready to begin the Spring Boot project. So at start.spring.io, you can generate a project with these dependencies: Spring Web, JDBC API, and MySQL driver. And that will give us everything that we need to develop a RESTful API that uses the JDBC API to interact with the MySQL database. Before you do anything else, we need to set up in application.properties the details for our database. You'll find the application.properties file in the resources folder that is in src main. And these are the details that you need to enter: the URL for the database, the username, and the password. Now these are the default username and password, which is likely what you will have for your database. But if you set it to be anything else, then you need to put your credentials at this point. And this will allow IntelliJ to find the database that we just created. Because we'll want to interact with the book table in the database, we're going to create a Java class called book, and each book object will represent one row in the book table in the database. And this is what the book class looks like. Nothing very adventurous. We've got an ID and a title field. Those correspond to the two columns in the database table. We've got a constructor method that takes these two parameters and uses them to update those two fields. We then have a get method for each of the two fields, and that's it. The book class is very straightforward. Now we need to write the REST API and also a file for generated requests so that we are able to test the endpoints that we put into the controller. So let's go into IntelliJ and take a look at the project. So here we have the controller. It's a REST controller. It has a request mapping that is book, and that will serve as the prefix for all the URLs for each endpoint. So we'll have book/all, and then lower down, we'll have book/ID, book/create, book/update, and so on. So let's take a look at book/all. That's the endpoint URL. Our method is called allBooks, and it's going to return a list of book objects. So before we do anything else, we'll create that list as an array list, and then we'll get a connection. Now this method is declared lower down in the class, so let's go and take a look by holding down the control key and click, and that gives us the method. We're going to use the same URL for the database as we put into the application.properties file. And then, as we saw in the previous video, we're going to load the driver class, and then from driver manager, we can get the connection using this URL, and then return that database connection. That connection gets stored in this variable, and we can use that to prepare a statement using that SQL statement. And because it's a select statement, we'll use execute query to obtain a result set. Now that result set will have 0 or more rows. So we'll use a while loop to access the next row in the result set. And from that row, we'll get the ID and the title as an int and a string to pass that into the new book constructor method. And with that new book object, we'll then add it to the list of books. And that'll happen once for each row in the result set. And by the time we finish processing the result set, we'll have the same number of book objects in the list of books as there are rows in the result set. And then we can close the connection and finally return books. Another endpoint is where we might want to get an individual book using an ID. So in the path, we put the path variable ID, and then in the method, we link the parameter ID to the path variable ID by using that annotation. Now this ID might or might not be found. So I'm going to initialize the book variable to null. And then if we don't find a book with this ID, that null is what will be returned here. To find out whether there is a book with that ID, we'll get a connection calling the same method that we looked at a few minutes ago. Then prepare a statement with this SQL statement. Select star from book where ID equals, and the question mark, of course, is the placeholder. So we need to provide a value for that placeholder number 1, and we give it the ID that has come on the URL and will serve as the selection criterion. Then we execute the query to get the result set, and it will either give us 1 book or no books. So we'll use an if statement here, and if there is a row returned, then we'll return a new book object using the values from the database, and that book object is then stored in the book variable, ready to be returned at the end of the method. Close the connection, then return the book. You can go on and do similar things with create, this time using an insert statement, an update. Here we're using a whole book coming in as the request body, and then we can get hold of that book B and use its title and its ID for updating the book. Notice that we've got 2 placeholders. This is the first, that's the second. So this first one is the title, set title equal to whatever comes in here, where ID equals, and that's the second placeholder, so we use that index 2 to set the ID ready to execute the update. We can use a deletion, so here the path will be book/delete/ and then the ID of the book we want to delete. Again, set up the prepared statement and then execute the update to perform the deletion. So a fairly straightforward RESTful API that makes use of the JDBC API to interact directly with our MySQL database. When we want to test this, we can set up, as I have done here in the generated requests, which I have renamed by prefixing the project and then moving it from scratches and consoles into the project folder structure. Then we can get a book, which is the default welcome. Then we can get all books and create a book. Now with this, we're passing in a string as the payload. So we must remember to put the blank line here between the URL and the payload. We're also getting an individual book, one that exists, one that doesn't, and updating a book. Again, we're passing in a payload, but this time it's an object. So we're setting the content type to be JSON so that the web server knows how to convert this string. So it now knows that it's a JSON string, so it will then convert that into a book object and put it into the parameter of the update method, and so on. So a very simple application that makes use of the JDBC API. And in later videos, we'll see how to do all of this in a better way. Now, when we want to run the application, we must first ensure that MySQL is running. So we'll do that from the XAMPP control panel. And then we can start the application and run those generated requests. Now, at some point, we might want to reset the database after we've done our tests, in which case we can execute this pair of SQL commands to drop the book table and then to create the book table again. So when you've done all of this and you've got it working on your computer, you will have used JDBC to interact with MySQL from your RESTful API.